Hi, Mr. Wells. This is my Bible presentation on Exodus 7 through Exodus 11. So, on the first slide, the topic is on the plagues of Egypt. There were 10 plagues in Egypt during this time, and the plagues lasted for about 4 to 5 months, almost 6 months total. The plagues were targeting the Egyptians after they enslaved the Israelites, and they were given by God, or carried out by God. The first 3 plagues were on everyone in Egypt, including the Israelites. Background knowledge about Egypt. The Egyptians worshipped multiple gods, and some of these gods included Ra, Set, Osiris, Isis, and Anubis. Crocodiles were sometimes referred to as serpents. So, for example, when Aaron's staff turned into a serpent, it could have been a crocodile. So the Egyptians, having crocodiles as one of their main symbols in their gods, could have had some possible power over crocodiles, although we'll get into the magicians a little bit later. Pharaohs were believed to be chosen by gods, so this is important in how God gives out the last plague, but we'll get to that later as well. On the topic of magicians, the magicians who replicated the plagues could have been well versed in sleight of hand, which is just tricks. Just tricks. Yep, just tricks. Just swift movements and tricks. Magicians could not reverse them. They could only replicate the plagues, and this could have just been because of a ruse. Magicians today rely on illusions and sleight of hand, which are magic tricks, such as like the bunny coming out of the hat. The first plague. The first plague was water into blood. When Aaron's staff connected it with the water, the Nile is turned into blood. The Egyptian water god was happy, and by changing water into blood, God proved himself more powerful than the water god. The plague lasted for 7 days. Egyptian magicians were actually able to replicate this plague, surprisingly. The second plague. The second plague was a rain of frogs, and frogs just everywhere. The frogs were so loud that someone could have gone deaf. Hecate was the Egyptian goddess of fertility and had a frog head, and God is using these plagues, in my opinion, what I found from my research is God is using these plagues to prove that these gods are basically powerless. The frogs came from the Nile River, and the Egyptian magicians were able to recreate this plague. And actually, on the Nile River was very important to the Egyptians. It gave them a lot of their water and also crops and irrigation. So if he's turning all these things from the Nile, that means he's showing a lot of power over the Egyptian community itself. The third plague. The third plague was the lice plague. This is when God turned dust into lice and fleas and gnats. It was also when fleas and gnats rose from the earth. It wasn't just lice. Some people think it's just lice, but it was also fleas and gnats. Geb was the Egyptian god of the earth, and by turning the earth or dust into lice, fleas and gnats, God shows his power over Geb. Egyptian magicians are unable to replicate this plague, and they actually said in one of the sources that this was the finger of God. The fourth plague. The fourth plague was swarms of flies. The swarms of flies could also have been locusts, but we'll touch on that later because swarms of locusts was later, in a later plague. The locusts later on tore through crops and hurt people, whereas flies were more of just a warning, and they just bothered everyone. Khepri was the Egyptian god of the, he's one of the aspects of Ra and had the head of a fly. The fifth plague. The fifth plague was the death of the cattle and livestock. The cow was pretty sacred to Egypt, and then one of the goddesses, Hathor, had the head of a cow, and killing them was like direct insult to these gods. But God is just showing his power, immense power over these gods, and that they're basically pointless. Additionally, cattle were a main source of food, income, and transportation. And so by killing the cattle, he was basically nullifying their chances of survival of plagues. The sixth plague. The sixth plague was ashes turning to boiling sores. This was the only plague that went unannounced, which means that Moses or God didn't tell Pharaoh or warn him. The dust that flew in the air turned to boils, and this is much like the lice plague, where the dust turned into lice and fleas and gnats, but they turned into boils instead. So whenever the dust came in contact with people, it erupted into boils. Isis was the goddess of medicine, so God is not only showing power over Geb in this plague, but also over Isis, because she cannot cure these ailments. Cleanliness was also very important in Egypt, and this is not clean. Boils and sores are not clean, as some acne or is caused by oily skin, and oily skin is not clean generally. The seventh plague. The seventh plague was the plague of the fire hail. So this could have been just really, really bad hail, but that's kind of unlikely because the climate was very hot. So if it was actual fire, that's actually very shocking. So there is a warning given. Pharaoh is warned, but again, he does not heed the warning. And by this time, other Egyptians actually start to reconsider their options and start to think that Pharaoh could be wrong. In the Egyptian fields, there were 3 crops: flax, barley, and wheat. Flax and barley were destroyed, but wheat survived, which means that God could have been giving them a second chance, although this is technically the 7th chance, because God could have probably killed them on the first plague if he wanted to. Nut is the goddess of sky, and he's showing power of the goddess of sky by raining down fire. The 8th plague. The 8th plague is the locusts, and as I was saying earlier, the locusts were more of a threat, not as a warning or weak warning. The locusts were sent from the sky, and also apparently there were also other wild beasts that were loosed upon the Egyptians, such as maybe like wildebeests. But Set was a god of wild animals, and so God is showing power over this deity, or fake deity, or mythical deity. The locusts destroyed the wheat, which was previously left alive in the 7th plague, which is this plague. So he's showing them mercy in the 7th plague, and taking away that chance, because basically the Egyptians just threw it away. And the Pharaoh still didn't listen after this, so he gave them the 3 days of darkness. The darkness was tangible and could be felt all over Egypt. The sun was the most worshipped thing in Egypt, and Ra was their god, their main god. And by showing he has power over Ra, he's showing he has power over most of Egypt. And the darkness was a representation of death also, because crops couldn't grow, which means that people couldn't survive. So this also foreshadows the next plague. The last plague and the next plague from the 9th plague is the death of the firstborn. To prevent slaughter, Israelites had to cover their doorposts or door thresholds with lamb's blood. Lamb's blood was the sacrifice that represented Jesus later on, but this isn't really too relevant because Jesus wasn't in the Old Testament. The Pharaoh is considered the descendant of the gods, which I said earlier on, and basically I'll elaborate now. Pharaoh was considered basically a god and revered by his people, and so by killing his first son, basically this is nullifying the rest, all influence, or the whatever he has left over all the people, so he has no power basically now. Previously to this, God and Moses tried to bargain with Pharaoh, saying that if he left Egypt or something, then he would be okay and they wouldn't unleash the plague. But Pharaoh just basically tried to bargain with them, so Moses and God got fed up. The angel of death who took away the lives of the firstborn of the Egyptians could have been the Holy Spirit, but we don't know. It could have been foreshadowing the Holy Spirit also, but we don't know that for sure. Thank you, Mr. Wells. This concludes my Bible presentation.